if I were drafting, who are the top 5 players in fantasy right now that is a must-have?
Yeah, I think Jonathan Taylor sits at the very top of that list, running back for the Colts. Just a fantasy football force. I think Christian McCaffrey's still up there. Fantasy players have been bummed out with the injuries, but when he plays, he's great. You've got a couple wideouts, Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, who absolutely dominated last year, that should be near the top of drafts. And then one of the more interesting names will be, does Derrick Henry still have that same Derrick Henry inside of him as he piles up all of these touches over the past few years, because he is a fantasy force as well. So that's some of the names I think you'll see at the top of drafts. So
interesting, right? From a analyst perspective, and what the running back has become in terms of, salary cap allocation and importance on a team, seemingly is different with the fantasy side of it because of why the amount of touches they get. Why are they so? Because they can get receptions as well as rushes. I mean, why are they so important on the fantasy side in comparison to maybe the game planning aspect of a real game?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think a lot of people that are brand new to fantasy, their default answer of who they think would be drafted first is the quarterback.
Right.
But in fantasy football, you end up starting multiple running backs, and there are so few running backs that have consistent workloads. And so they get prioritized a lot in fantasy because, beyond a handful of players like the aforementioned Jonathan Taylor, Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon, those guys, you have a lot of committee backfields. And that's really become the norm in the NFL, is to see, 2 or 3 backs make an impact. You just talked about, teams are willing to move on instead of paying the big contract because they can form committee backfields with younger players or less expensive players. But in fantasy, it's just about scarcity. It's about how many of this elite player at this position exists. And in running backs, it's hard to find them.
Hey, Andy, Chris Brockman here. Let's talk about who we're staying away from and who are our sleepers. Who do we not want on our team, and then who can we get later in drafts that are going to help us win?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the big names in terms of a breakout/sleeper candidate this year is Javonte Williams in Denver, because I heard the Rich Eisen with Justin Herbert discussion before I came on. Like that division has some flamethrowers in it now. You've got offenses that are going to put up big points. Russell Wilson arrives in Denver, and here's Javonte Williams at 22 years old with the whole world in front of him. Melvin Gordon is there for one more year, but every fantasy player wants to know when Javonte Williams is going to kind of take over. And so he's a big name that I think will be polarizing for fantasy football players. And then on the other side, I think they're really afraid to mess around with the wide receivers in Seattle. I think DK Metcalf, what a physical force he is. Tyler Lockett, he's been great for years, but here you have the departure of Russell Wilson. And I don't know if it's we place our trust in Geno Smith or Drew Lock is going to get it done for fantasy.